Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Not battles, not kings plotting over kingdoms, not even a particularly dramatic plague. Tonight we're going to talk about laws, but not just any laws. We're talking about the laws that, for some reason, seemed specifically designed to make women mildly miserable until they didn't. And then, of course, they broke them, which, in hindsight, seems both bold and incredibly exhausting. So, dim the lights, curl up with a blanket, and let's float gently into a world where everyday rules were more like suggestions, if you dared to ignore them. Let's start in a place you might expect: medieval Europe. Somewhere between the 12th and 16th centuries, a woman stepping outside in the wrong color dress could be committing a crime. Yes, really. The idea that colors might be illegal seems quaint now, but back then, clothing wasn't just about fashion. It was about hierarchy, status, and your ability to annoy the local lord or bishop without even trying. Some nobles mandated that only certain colors, reds, blues, or golds, could be worn by women of a particular rank. Anyone else caught in, say, an outrageously cheerful green could be fined or scolded. And of course, there were women who, perhaps tired of this, just wore green anyway. Because why not double down? Take, for instance, a story from late medieval England. A woman named Matilda, not to be confused with several other Matildas, because history loves reusing names, was fined repeatedly for wearing a shade of violet that the local lord considered too flashy. Each time she was confronted, she'd apologize in a tone so politely sarcastic that the officials didn't quite know how angry to be. Violet, at the time, was a tricky color. It suggested wealth and social prominence, and Matilda, being of slightly less noble stock, wasn't technically allowed to wear it. Still, she did, and somehow managed to charm her way out of the worst punishments. One can imagine her sitting at a window, sipping ale, thinking, well, they told me not to, but I do like this shade. Moving slightly east, over in France, there was Jean, a laundress whose crime was, apparently, laughing too loudly in public. The law didn't quite phrase it that way, of course. It was something about disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. But historians like to speculate. Jean's town council considered laughter a serious offense, particularly for women, because loud laughter might encourage male misbehavior, or perhaps it was simply that she had an annoyingly contagious laugh. Regardless, Jean kept at it. When the council sent an official to reprimand her, she reportedly greeted him with her loudest, most obnoxious chuckle and said, "Oh, am I breaking a law again?" Of course, we can't talk about women breaking rules without mentioning the endlessly fascinating case of Anne of Brittany. She was technically a duchess, which meant she had more legal privileges than most people walking around in their linen dresses, but she was also subject to very specific royal rules. Rules designed to prevent her from exercising personal freedom. She wasn't allowed to remarry without the king's consent. She couldn't travel freely, and her wardrobe choices were constantly scrutinized. And yet, accounts suggest she would sometimes invite musicians into the court late at night, drink wine excessively, and laugh at formal ceremonies that were otherwise quite dull. One historian put it mildly: she had a curious tendency to behave like a person rather than a duchess. It's fascinating, really, how often these laws seem like suggestions that someone decided should be enforceable. And even more fascinating is how often women quietly ignored them. For instance, in Venice during the 16th century, there were laws about widowhood. Widows were technically expected to live modestly, dress plainly, and avoid public entertainments. But widows had money, and money gives you a kind of slow-motion freedom. Many Venetian widows did what we might today call making the best of it. They threw parties, dressed in expensive silks, and traveled around the canals with little regard for what the local council might mutter behind their hands. And because Venice was, in general, a city built on spectacle, the authorities didn't really know what to do, especially when a widow had friends in influential families. Even religious rules, which were supposed to be absolute, could be bent. Nuns in various convents throughout Europe sometimes broke strict dietary laws or curfew rules. For example, in one 15th-century Italian convent, the nuns were forbidden from eating meat on certain days, which is fair enough. But records show that Sister Beatrice, because, again, history loves recycling names, had a quiet habit of smuggling bits of chicken into her room. She wasn't conspiring or plotting anything revolutionary. She just liked meat. And when questioned, she would respond with a calm, "I think the chicken just wandered in on its own," which somehow seemed plausible enough to let her continue. And this leads us to a gentle observation about these laws. They were almost always about controlling behavior that was inherently human: joy, curiosity, vanity, hunger, or a tendency to laugh at authority. So, in a sense, women who broke these rules weren't criminals. They were very patient comedians in a slow, oppressive world. Their acts of rebellion were small, almost imperceptible, but somehow still persistent. Let's drift over to England again, to a slightly more modern time, the 17th century. At this point, laws still existed that limited women's behavior, but now they were codified in more bureaucratic ways. Women were prohibited from certain forms of education, from owning property independently in some cases, and from speaking publicly about topics deemed inappropriate. But as history tends to show, prohibited didn't mean ignored. Women like Margaret Cavendish, who eventually became the Duchess of Newcastle, wrote books about science, philosophy, and the natural world. Her writing style might not have been everyone's cup of tea. It was occasionally dense and strange, but she wasn't particularly worried about critics. And because she had noble connections, there wasn't much anyone could do beyond muttering about her lack of modesty. Across Europe, in Russia, there was Catherine the Great, whose life provides another gentle lesson in ignoring rules. Officially, she was supposed to act demurely as a foreign princess married to a Russian heir. In practice, she rewrote the rules, at least for herself. She educated herself in philosophy, corresponded with famous thinkers like Voltaire, and quietly consolidated power in ways that made her husband, Peter III, look like a bemused spectator. Catherine's rule-breaking wasn't small-scale like sneaking meat or wearing violet. It was grand, ambitious, and occasionally bureaucratic. But the pattern is the same. Women navigating restrictive systems, finding loopholes, and living on their own terms, even if society hoped they wouldn't. Meanwhile, back in more ordinary towns, records exist of women who defied local statutes in subtler ways. In parts of France and Germany, it was illegal for women to sell certain goods independently or to act as apothecaries without male supervision. But women often ran small markets, brewed potions, or practiced midwifery regardless of paperwork. One can imagine the tiny bureaucrats muttering as they walked past, "She's at it again," while the women quietly counted coins. By the 18th century, some laws had softened, but the spirit of rule-breaking remained. In England, women could be fined for riding horses astride rather than side saddle, because, apparently, a lady might lose her virtue if she sat like a man. Yet, of course, women rode astride anyway, often quite comfortably, laughing softly as the local magistrate grumbled. And in salons, women gathered to discuss literature and politics, sometimes loudly, sometimes fiercely, always gently flouting social expectations. And so, if we drift toward the broader picture, we see a pattern. Over hundreds of years, women encountered countless laws that were less about justice and more about control. They were told what to wear, how to speak, what to eat, when to laugh, and where to stand. And in many cases, they just didn't. They bent the rules, ignored the rules, or politely rewrote them for their own lives. There's something quietly comforting about that, isn't there? That even in the past, people found small ways to assert autonomy in a slow, deliberate, unexciting rebellion. In the next section, we'll explore some particularly charming examples of women whose lives were just slightly inconvenient for the law. There's a nun who hosted secret poetry readings, a widow who opened a floating tea house in Venice, and a young aristocrat who kept a pet monkey in direct violation of a royal decree. Each of these stories is gentle, dryly amusing, and a tiny rebellion against centuries of thou shalt nots. So, for now, settle in, let your eyelids get heavy, and imagine the world of violet dresses, smuggled chicken, and quietly defiant laughter. Because history, as we're seeing, is full of people who didn't make waves. They just quietly ignored the rules and went about their lives, occasionally annoying a magistrate or two. And there's a soothing rhythm to that, a reminder that even when life is full of absurd restrictions, you can still find small ways to be yourself. And so, if we drift toward the broader picture, we see a pattern. Over hundreds of years, women encountered countless laws that were less about justice and more about control. They were told what to wear, how to speak, what to eat, when to laugh, and where to stand. And in many cases, they just didn't. They bent the rules, ignored the rules, or politely rewrote them for their own lives. There's something quietly comforting about that, isn't there? That even in the past, people found small ways to assert autonomy in a slow, deliberate, unexciting rebellion. In the next section, we'll explore some particularly charming examples of women whose lives were just slightly inconvenient for the law. There's a nun who hosted secret poetry readings, a widow who opened a floating tea house in Venice, and a young aristocrat who kept a pet monkey in direct violation of a royal decree. Each of these stories is gentle, dryly amusing, and a tiny rebellion against centuries of thou shalt nots. So, for now, settle in, let your eyelids get heavy, and imagine the world of violet dresses, smuggled chicken, and quietly defiant laughter. Because history, as we're seeing, is full of people who didn't make waves. They just quietly ignored the rules and went about their lives, occasionally annoying a magistrate or two. And there's a soothing rhythm to that, a reminder that even when life is full of absurd restrictions, you can still find small ways to be yourself.
All right, let's drift back into the slow currents of history, where rules were abundant and women found the quietest, gentlest ways to ignore them. Some of these stories are small, almost imperceptible acts. Others are slightly bolder, but none of them involve sword fights, revolutions, or loud chaos. Just slow, polite, and persistent defiance. First, let's return to the nuns we briefly mentioned before. Nuns were supposed to live lives of discipline, obedience, and quiet prayer. That was the theory. The reality was often slightly different. Sister Beatrice, whom we met in part 1, was not alone. Across 15th and 16th century convents in Italy, France, and Spain, there were reports of nuns hosting small poetry readings after curfew, sharing recipes for pastries that technically violated fasting rules, and even swapping letters that included flirtatious, worldly jokes. Imagine a small stone-walled convent, moonlight slanting across the floor, and a group of nuns whispering lines of Ronsard and Petrarch, while a prioress shook her head in mild exasperation. It wasn't dramatic. It was, in a way, charming. And it was technically illegal, according to monastic law. Some nuns even got a bit creative. One convent had a rule that forbade women from keeping pets because pets might distract from devotion. But Sister Lucia kept a small bird, an inconspicuous songbird, inside her cell. She fed it scraps and hummed to it at night. She didn't flaunt it, she didn't announce it in the chapel, but when questioned, she shrugged and said something along the lines of, "It keeps me company during long prayers." The authorities didn't exactly know how to respond. How do you punish companionship? So she continued quietly breaking the law, day after day, until the bird became almost legendary in that convent. Moving beyond common walls, widows offer another fascinating category of gentle rebellion. Venice, as I mentioned earlier, had strict rules for widows. Live modestly, dress plainly, avoid drawing attention, and generally accept that your life would shrink to something small and restrained. Some widows accepted it, sure, but many did not. There's a record of a widow, Marietta, who owned a small gondola business. Officially, she wasn't supposed to travel freely or conduct independent trade, but she did. She ferried goods and passengers, kept a ledger, and occasionally entertained guests on her gondola with music and wine. She skirted regulations so quietly that the local authorities eventually gave up, muttering about her cleverness and probably wishing they had a boat of their own. And then there are aristocratic women whose lives seem polished and perfect on paper, but who also found tiny cracks in their gilded cages. Lady Elizabeth, a 17th century English noblewoman, was not allowed to write publicly or engage in political debate. Yet she hosted salons in her home, invited scholars and thinkers, and, according to some letters, gently mocked the men who tried to dictate her behavior. Her rebellions were not scandalous in the sense of dueling or intrigue. They were polite, intellectual subversions. A line of critique here, a slightly pointed question there, a quiet but firm insistence that her mind was her own. And in a slow, almost sleepy way, she carved out autonomy in a world that preferred to define her entirely by marriage, rank, and obedience. In France, another gentle law-breaking occurred around public decorum. Women were supposed to bow, curtsy, and maintain an aura of perfect politeness in courts and public spaces. Some did, of course, but many chose subtle mockery instead. One woman would bow so deeply her skirts swept the floor, pause dramatically, and then rise with a perfectly neutral expression, leaving the court officials uncertain whether to be offended or amused. Another would respond to overly formal greetings with a soft, ironic smile, and continue walking, leaving the would-be disciplinarian flustered. These tiny acts of defiance weren't written into law, but they were noticed slowly over time. It's also worth noting that not all rebellions were deliberate. Some were simply the result of curiosity or practicality. Women in medieval towns sometimes violated food regulations simply because the laws didn't match reality. Bread might be restricted to a certain weight. Fish might be forbidden on fast days. Or wine might be rationed for particular classes. But life, as usual, was messier than law books suggested. Women baked, traded, and prepared meals in ways that satisfied their households, occasionally earning fines or scolding, but mostly continuing undeterred. In short, across Europe, from Italy to England, France to Russia, there were women quietly testing the boundaries of rules, laws, and expectations. Their acts were rarely dramatic. They didn't overthrow governments. They didn't incite revolutions. They simply found small, human ways to live their lives in systems that preferred them quiet, obedient, and invisible. And in that slow, persistent rebellion, there's a rhythm, a gentle comfort. Laws may try to dictate behavior, but people, as always, will find tiny cracks and slip through. So, as we continue to drift through this sleepy exploration, imagine the subtle, quiet rebellion of history's women. The violet dresses, the smuggled. Sometimes rebellion took the form of fashion, or more specifically, ignoring fashion laws. In parts of Germany and France, women of the upper classes were forbidden to wear certain types of jewelry, particular fabrics, or extravagant hairstyles. The lawmakers were usually men who assumed modesty equated to obedience. But a woman named Wilhelmina, a countess in Bavaria, ignored these rules entirely. She wore pearls, ribbons, and fabrics that shimmered against the sun, just to see the magistrates frown. She didn't run away, and she didn't flaunt it dramatically. She simply dressed as she pleased and moved about her estates with serene confidence. In retrospect, the law seemed almost absurd, and she knew it. Merchants' wives offer yet another slow, satisfying example. In towns across Europe, women were prohibited from engaging directly in trade without their husband's supervision. But when husbands travelled or died, these women quietly stepped into the role themselves. They ran shops, sold goods in markets, and occasionally bribed officials with pastries or hand-painted trinkets to avoid scrutiny. One account tells of a woman who ran a small spice shop in Paris in the early 18th century. She technically needed male approval for every transaction, but she developed a system of secret marks, discreet messages, and careful bookkeeping that allowed her shop to operate independently for decades. When officials finally realized it was more annoyance than punishment, they had been watching her for years without ever catching her doing anything truly improper. And here's a slightly amusing intersection of curiosity and law. Pet ownership. In England, during the 16th and 17th centuries, aristocratic women were sometimes forbidden from keeping certain animals, particularly exotic pets, without royal permission. Yet, the letters and diaries of the time are full of women quietly ignoring this. A lady might have a monkey, a small parrot, or even a tame fox wandering her gardens. One woman, Lady Margaret.
All right, let's float a little closer to the gilded halls and quiet corridors of power, where the rules were many, the expectations heavier, and the acts of rebellion a bit more aristocratic. Because, of course, women in power had laws layered on top of laws, many unwritten, most designed to keep them perfectly contained, and yet they rarely were. Take, for instance, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine, technically a queen of France, married to King Henry II, a man whose hobbies included jousting and sighing deeply at courtly ceremonies. Catherine, meanwhile, had to navigate the perilous waters of being foreign, a wife, a mother, and occasionally a woman who liked to keep her own counsel. There were countless restrictions placed on her as a queen: how to dress, when to appear in public, whom to see, and how to raise her children. But Catherine had a slow, deliberate method of quietly ignoring rules. She hosted salons, encouraged arts and science, and managed her own political maneuvering with subtlety. She even experimented with cosmetics and recipes, because why not test new potions while the court fussed about proper conduct? In essence, Catherine was a lawbreaker in soft, aristocratic ways. She respected appearances, but only enough to keep the courtiers guessing. Moving slightly east to Russia, we find Catherine the Great, whom we briefly mentioned in part 1. Catherine was legally expected to behave like a demure foreign princess, but she wasn't. She educated herself, corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers, and slowly consolidated power behind her husband Peter III's bemused eyes. She rewrote the rules entirely for herself, all while maintaining a polite, calm facade. One might say she made a sport of it. When the law or expectation was inconvenient, she found ways around it, and when those ways involved letters to Voltaire or rearranging the hierarchy of the court, well, she was entirely unapologetic. In England, Queen Elizabeth I also found herself in a web of laws and expectations that she quietly, cleverly navigated. Women were supposed to marry, produce heirs, and generally behave like decorative extensions of their husbands or fathers. Elizabeth ignored this entirely. She never married, often teased her suitors, and ruled a kingdom with a mix of charm, patience, and meticulous law-bending. She adopted the persona of the Virgin Queen, which technically complied with expectations of chastity, but in practice allowed her an enormous personal and political freedom. She spoke, she traveled, she held court, and she did it all with a calm, unhurried precision that made her appear almost entirely compliant, even when she was anything but. Of course, not all law-breaking was political or strategic. Some was delightfully mundane and very aristocratic. Marie Antoinette, famous or infamous for her extravagant tastes, technically broke numerous courtly and social expectations. She wore elaborate gowns that may have violated local sumptuary rules, hosted private parties that were frowned upon, and reportedly enjoyed small amusements that irritated older courtiers. One historian remarked that her penchant for private, playful activities was technically illegal, in the sense that the rigid court had no space for such frivolity. But Marie Antoinette, perhaps exhausted by protocol, did them anyway. It's hard to imagine her being subtle, but she managed it in the quiet, opulent way that only a young queen in Versailles could. Let's shift the duchesses and countesses, who often had smaller domains but no less strict oversight. Duchess Anne of Mecklenburg, a relatively obscure figure but notable for her tiny rebellions, was forbidden from entertaining young artists at her estate, as it was considered inappropriate for a woman of her rank. Naturally, she did, hosting piano lessons, poetry readings, and occasional theatrical performances. She never shouted or disrupted. She merely arranged her household according to her tastes, gently ignoring the rule that she should have stayed in quiet domestic obedience. Similarly, Widowed aristocrats often found themselves in strange legal limbos. A widow might technically be forbidden from independently owning land or collecting rents, yet many quietly did. Marguerite de Valois, a queen and widow in late 16th century France, managed her estates with remarkable autonomy. She navigated convoluted inheritance laws, occasionally flouted minor prohibitions about public appearances, and maintained salons that were technically outside what her royal status should allow. And, naturally, she did all this while wearing dresses that were, by some accounts, spectacularly disobedient to local fashion laws. Even in smaller towns, law-breaking had a genteel flavor. Aristocratic women would sometimes travel disguised as men, ostensibly to visit relatives or observe distant properties. Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, is recorded to have done this occasionally. Officially, it was improper for a woman of her rank to ride unaccompanied, and certainly to don male clothing. Practically, she found it the most efficient way to manage her lands, negotiate agreements, and observe her holdings. Officials, if they noticed, often wrote letters of polite astonishment rather than issuing fines. And she did it anyway, quietly, effectively, and entirely without fanfare.
Of course, there's a long tradition of women bending minor ecclesiastical laws for personal benefit. In England and France, some women ignored restrictions on attending certain services or participating in rituals. One gentle example is a woman named Helene, who attended multiple church services on Sundays despite a local edict limiting her participation to a single chapel. She brought friends, laughed quietly in pews, and returned home to gossip politely. It was technically a violation, but the law was so slow-moving that it rarely mattered. Her rebellion was methodical, measured, and utterly charming in its quiet persistence. Sometimes, law-breaking involved public spectacle, but in a very slow, aristocratic way. For instance, certain duchesses were forbidden to host elaborate musical events in their private homes, as this could attract too much attention and disrupt the social order. Yet, Duchess Luisa in northern Italy regularly ignored this. She invited musicians, arranged candlelit performances, and discreetly flouted her household regulations. If anyone complained, she responded with polite apologies and gestures so ceremonious that no one could enforce the law effectively. The rebellion was soft, controlled, almost soothing. In Russia, there were similar patterns. Aristocratic women were supposed to maintain modesty, avoid public debate, and refrain from appearing in mixed-gender social gatherings without chaperones. Yet, historical letters describe women quietly attending intellectual debates, engaging with visiting scholars, and forming circles of influence. Their law-breaking wasn't dramatic. It was polite, slow, and deliberate. A historian once described one such woman's gatherings as technically improper, practically delightful, and of course, not all rule-breaking was purposeful or conscious. Sometimes it was born of necessity. Widows managing estates or daughters running businesses in cities often violated local statutes, simply because the rules didn't match reality. A widow might hire workers, pay taxes, and sell goods independently, not out of rebellion, but because she had to. Yet in retrospect, these small acts of practical defiance look remarkably like quiet rebellion. They were unexciting, non-violent, and fully effective in subtly challenging systems of control. As we drift toward the end of this part of our gentle exploration, we begin to see a pattern. Women, whether nuns, widows, aristocrats or queens, found slow, elegant, sometimes amusing ways to navigate laws that sought to constrain them. They bent rules quietly, sometimes deliberately, sometimes for practical reasons, and always with a calm, understated persistence. Their rebellions weren't dramatic, they weren't thrilling, they didn't shock or awe, but they existed gently, persistently, and quietly enough to leave a trace in history that is oddly comforting to observe. So as we let our eyelids grow heavier, imagine these women walking softly through courtrooms, convents, markets, and estates, smiling just slightly, bending rules ever so gently, and leaving small ripples in the slow currents of law. Their acts were polite, understated, and persistent, reminding us that even in worlds dominated by rigid structures, quiet autonomy always finds a way.
All right, let's settle in a bit deeper. We've visited nuns, widows, and queens. Now, let's float gently towards smaller towns, provincial villages, and quieter corners of history, where laws were plenty, scrutiny was often tedious, and women quietly discovered loopholes, or simply ignored the rules entirely. These are the subtle, unremarkable rebellions that leave tiny ripples in the historical record, just enough to make us smile softly and nod, human nature. In 16th century England, for example, there were laws specifying how many chickens a woman could own. This seems ridiculous, of course, but it mattered at the local level. Town councils, often dominated by men who liked rules on paper more than in practice, believed controlling livestock prevented economic unfairness, or at least that's what they claimed. Women, naturally, did not always comply. There's a record of a woman named Agnes who quietly expanded her small flock well beyond legal limits. She kept a ledger, hid chickens in clever ways, and occasionally lost a bird during inspections. No one ever punished her harshly, and over time, the council seemed to forget the rule entirely. Agnes's rebellion was tiny, utterly domestic, and endlessly patient. Similarly, across rural France, women sometimes ignored restrictions on milling and baking. A widow might be prohibited from operating a mill independently because such work was considered male labor. But necessity, combined with a sense of quiet practicality, usually overrode legality. Women ran mills, baked bread, and occasionally argued politely with officials when confronted. One account notes a woman who refused to stop operating her mill despite repeated warnings. She wasn't dramatic. She simply kept milling day after day, while the town officials grew increasingly resigned to her independence.
Food laws, in particular, were a gentle source of rebellion. Across Europe, there were prohibitions against eating certain foods on certain days, primarily for religious reasons. Fish on Fridays, no meat during Lent, and so forth. Yet historical records contain dozens of minor, polite infractions. Women would hide eggs, prepare meat dishes discreetly, or swap ingredients to skirt the law. One can almost imagine the quiet domestic choreography. A woman moving through her kitchen, smiling gently, carefully balancing observance and defiance. Marriage laws also produced quiet rebellions. In some towns, women were restricted in whom they could marry, especially if they belonged to merchant or artisan families with guild restrictions. Some women however, found clever ways to bypass these regulations. One young woman, a miller's daughter, allegedly arranged her marriage with a blacksmith across the river, simply ignoring the paperwork and notifying the council only after the ceremony. Officials were mildly irritated, but she had a new husband, a small farm, and a quiet, successful life. Her rebellion was polite, unexciting, and entirely effective. We also find examples in urban settings where commerce provided space for subtle defiance. Women in markets were often regulated, what they could sell, at what price, and under whose supervision. Yet the historical record is full of accounts of women bending these rules. A fishmonger in Marseille quietly sold slightly larger portions than permitted. A spice trader in Lyon occasionally ignored taxes on rare goods. And a hat maker in Paris sold decorative trimmings that were technically forbidden. Each act was small, methodical, and quiet. None sparked outrage, none caused riots, just soft, persistent defiance. In parts of Scandinavia, laws on public behavior were particularly curious. Women were expected to maintain certain demeanors in town squares, especially on market days. They were to bow to officials, avoid loud conversation, and generally appear modest. Yet women often engaged in polite, slow subversions. A widow might linger longer than allowed, gently teasing local officials with polite smiles, or a young woman might speak in a slightly too confident tone to a councilman. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just an understated insistence on personal space. Over time, these behaviors were noticed and, occasionally, grudgingly tolerated. Even travel laws could be quietly ignored. In parts of Italy and Spain, women needed male permission to journey beyond their home villages. Yet, records show women traveling alone or in small groups, ostensibly on errands, but sometimes exploring towns, meeting distant relatives, or observing local markets. Enforcement was slow, tedious, and often polite. Officials might note the irregularity in a ledger, mutter something about propriety, and move on. And the women, they continued traveling, slowly, politely, persistently. Some of the most interesting examples involve legal loopholes that women discovered and exploited. In Germany, for instance, there were regulations about property inheritance. Women could inherit only under certain conditions, often contingent on male approval. Yet clever widows, daughters, and merchants found loopholes in the wording of these laws. A phrase about temporary guardianship might allow a woman to control an estate for years, quietly collecting rents and managing labourers. By the time male relatives noticed, the estate was effectively hers. No dramatic confrontation, no sword fights, just slow, careful, patient exploitation of paperwork. And then, of course, there's the slightly charming phenomenon of municipal regulations about leisure. In England and France, some towns prohibited women from playing certain games in public, particularly gambling games. Yet records indicate women quietly flouted these rules. A small group might meet in back rooms, courtyards, or gardens to play cards, dice, or board games. If an official intervened, the women would politely pack up, move, and resume elsewhere. It's the kind of slow, repetitive rebellion that leaves almost no trace except in marginal notes in court records and diaries, a quiet echo of personal freedom. We also find fascinating examples of women quietly breaking symbolic laws. In parts of Europe, clothing, hats, and hairstyles were strictly regulated to maintain social hierarchies. Women of lower rank were forbidden from wearing certain fabrics or colors. Yet, countless women ignored these restrictions. Some wore ribbons slightly too bright, hats slightly too tall, or shoes slightly too extravagant. Enforcement was inconsistent, slow, and often resigned to observation rather than punishment. These small acts of defiance created a subtle rhythm across towns and cities. Women navigating rules gently, persistently, almost hypnotically. Even religious observance provided gentle opportunities for rebellion. Some laws dictated specific forms of prayer, attendance, or ritual behavior. Women often bent these rules quietly. They prayed at slightly different times, added personal touches to rituals, or gathered discreetly in ways that were technically prohibited. It wasn't about sacrilege. It was about personal autonomy, about finding tiny spaces to exist outside rigid expectations. And over time, these small deviations quietly shaped cultural norms, even if slowly. So, as we settle even further into our gentle journey, it's clear that women across centuries, whether queens, nuns, widows, or commoners, found innumerable ways to navigate restrictions, exploit loopholes, and quietly assert autonomy. The pattern is almost hypnotic. Laws exist, women ignore or bend them in subtle ways, officials notice, and life continues. Slowly, imperceptibly, quietly. It's repetitive, predictable, and strangely soothing, a rhythm in the currents of history. And now, as we let our eyelids grow heavier, imagine the gentle acts of rebellion we've observed. Hiding chickens, quietly baking forbidden bread, traveling alone under polite pretenses, attending multiple services, writing letters in secret, wearing slightly too bright ribbons, hosting small salons. None of it is loud, none of it is dramatic, none of it will keep you awake. But together, it forms a slow, comforting narrative of quiet autonomy, persistence, and humanity that drifts softly across the centuries.
Now let's stretch our gaze beyond Europe, into corners of the world where women also quietly challenged rules, bent laws, and occasionally did things that might seem peculiar to us today. Because, as it turns out, subtle rebellion is universal. Let's start in Japan during the Edo period. Japanese women were expected to live quietly within their households, follow strict codes of behavior, and maintain appearances according to social rank. Yet records suggest women found small ways to assert their autonomy. For instance, some women ran side businesses from their homes, selling fabric, food, or small crafts. Officially, this required male oversight, or at least permission. But many quietly ignored this, managing transactions and accounting themselves. One woman, in particular, reportedly kept ledgers and dealt with customers directly, even though the law technically prohibited her independence. She did so calmly, politely, and successfully, illustrating a universal principle. Rules are suggestions when patience and subtlety are applied. Moving to China during the Ming and Qing dynasties, women faced a dizzying array of restrictions, from foot binding to limitations on inheritance. Some women quietly resisted these rules, particularly around inheritance and property management. Widows or daughters in merchant families often found loopholes to control family assets, negotiate marriages, or manage businesses. There's an account of a merchant widow who quietly hired male clerks to handle legal documents, giving her the appearance of compliance while she maintained real authority. These acts were subtle, unexciting, and technically illegal, but entirely effective. In India, historical records note women occasionally defied rules around property ritual, and social appearance. In certain regions, widows were expected to shave their heads, wear plain clothes, and live a life of extreme austerity. Yet some widows quietly ignored this, retaining traditional hairstyles, wearing modestly colorful garments, and participating in local festivals. They moved slowly and politely, making sure to avoid confrontation while quietly asserting autonomy. One can imagine a widow walking through a village, slightly brighter than allowed, exchanging polite nods with onlookers, her quiet rebellion almost hypnotically calm. Even in the Ottoman Empire, women were subject to strict social codes. Elite women in particular had rules dictating movement, public interaction, and even speech. Yet some women found gentle ways to bend these laws. Harem women, for example, would correspond discreetly with scholars, manage household finances, and occasionally influence political decisions. Officially, many of these actions were forbidden or frowned upon, but in practice, subtlety was key. Letters, soft persuasion, and quiet organization allowed them to navigate the rules without ever raising alarms. Now let's drift into the slightly stranger side of law breaking. In Scandinavia, particularly in Iceland and Norway, women were sometimes forbidden from fishing certain rivers or harvesting specific plants. These laws were tied to property, superstition, or local customs. Yet women quietly ignored these restrictions. Fishing, gathering herbs, and trading goods discreetly. Enforcement was inconsistent, slow, and often resigned. A quiet act of rebellion became a repeated ritual. Women moving calmly, deliberately, almost meditatively, through fields and rivers, subtly shaping the economic and social landscape. In Africa, diverse societies also produced interesting restrictions. In some regions, women were prohibited from certain forms of trade or ritual participation. Yet historical accounts indicate women frequently bypassed these rules. They sold cloth, food, or pottery independently, managed estates, and quietly influenced community decisions. The enforcement of these restrictions was often slow and inconsistent, allowing for subtle but persistent acts of autonomy. And, as in Europe or Asia, these quiet defiance patterns left faint but meaningful traces in the historical record. A particularly charming case comes from the Caribbean during colonial times. Women, often in precarious legal positions, managed small businesses, farms, or homes. There were rules about property, trade, and labor, often designed to suppress autonomy. Yet women found clever ways to navigate them. One woman quietly traded goods along a coast, hid excess produce, and maintained relationships with local authorities who knew but did not punish her. The rhythm was slow, polite, and deliberate, much like other examples we've already observed. Quiet persistence shaping life around rigid laws. Even legal systems that were extraordinarily complex couldn't stop subtle rebellion. In Persia, women of certain classes were restricted in movement, public display, and property management. Yet historical letters suggest women quietly maintained influence, guided household decisions, and occasionally controlled financial matters that the law technically prohibited. Their acts were small, methodical, and entirely effective. Quiet rebellions executed with patience and discretion. Some of the most interesting cases are laws that seem almost comically specific. In France, there were towns where women were technically forbidden from keeping more than a certain number of pigs, or from walking on certain streets alone at night. In Japan,
women were restricted from carrying certain items, even small tools, in public markets. And in India, widows sometimes faced prohibitions on attending festivals or ceremonies. Yet in each case, women ignored, bent, or worked around these rules, quietly, politely, persistently. Their acts weren't dangerous, shocking, or thrilling, but they were enduring and subtly effective. And of course, there are cases where defiance combined curiosity and mischief. Some women in Europe and Asia maintained small gardens of forbidden plants, raised tiny animals in secret, or exchanged illicit books. Others wrote poetry or letters that skirted political and social norms, never loudly, never dramatically, just enough to claim autonomy. These acts were slow, repeated, and ritualistic, forming a gentle rhythm through time. Women quietly testing boundaries, exploring limits, and existing beyond the narrow channels set for them. So as we drift toward the end of this part of our gentle exploration, we see a universal pattern. Across continents, centuries, and cultures, women encountered laws that were excessive, controlling, or absurd. And yet, almost everywhere, they quietly found ways to bend, ignore, or subtly defy them. Whether through domestic action, economic maneuvering, social subtlety, or personal expression, the rebellions were small, soft, and endlessly persistent. As you begin to feel your eyelids heavier, imagine this quiet universality. Women walking through Japanese marketplaces, Chinese merchant quarters, Indian villages, Ottoman harems, Caribbean coasts, and European towns, each quietly asserting autonomy, bending laws with patience, elegance, and subtlety, leaving traces in ledgers, letters, and oral stories. Slow, gentle, persistent, almost hypnotic, really. A soft, calming rhythm across time and space, reminding us that human ingenuity is universal and quiet defiance is everywhere.